Over the past several days, we've been talking about the possibility of a tropical cyclone developing just off the Central American coast because the GFS model has been very persistent on developing a strong tropical cyclone as we approach next week. And it's no different in today's run of the GFS model, where the GFS model once again expects that right around late next week, it expects a well-defined low pressure system to develop just off the Honduras coast. We do see that there's a large area of convective activity going on right over Central America. Of course, typically during this time of the year, we see a very strong Central American gyre take place, which does bring about a lot more convective activity relative to the rest of the year. And we see that by Friday, June 16th, we have a pretty large area of convection right over Central America. And a large portion of this convection is right over the very warm Caribbean waters. So of course, we're bound to see the pressure lower along the surface for a more well-defined low pressure system to develop. And we do see that this low pressure system does develop as we approach the late Saturday into early Sunday timeframe of June 18th. And we see that moving even beyond this point, we see that this tropical cyclone not only becomes a tropical storm, but could potentially become a hurricane in the more long-term future. However, anything beyond the 200-hour mark especially, it becomes highly uncertain, as I wouldn't take this seriously just yet. However, if we were to move into a time period that's closer to that's at least closer in the near future, we do see that the GFS model is confident that within the next 7 days there will be a large area of convection right around the Southern Caribbean, and it's been persisting on this over the past several runs, which makes me believe that the GFS model at least has some idea of what's going on when it comes to tropical cyclone development by next week. It wouldn't be this persistent if it didn't have at least a little bit of an indication that there could be a tropical cyclone that does develop by next weekend. So this is definitely something we're going to need to pay close attention to over the next several days, as the certainty will certainly rise. We're now approaching that time period where now we can definitely more confidently say that this might not be another one of those fantasy GFS model type storms. And while I'll say beyond the 8 to 9 day mark, it does become more of a fantasy storm, because beyond this point, it becomes highly uncertain what the future holds for this storm system, as the GFS model does want to develop this into a hurricane. But at least for the more short-term future, we see that the GFS model before the 7 day mark, 6 to 7 days, does develop at least a low pressure system just off the Central American coast. So that certainly raises the possibility of tropical cyclone development, and this is definitely something you need to be now more aware of along the Central American coast. Definitely don't start making preparations just yet. It's still far too early for that, but definitely at least be aware of this possibility, because the GFS model has been very persistent on this idea. However, what raises the uncertainty with this forecast is the fact that the European model still is not even indicating that there's going to be a large enough area of moisture for the possibility to exist for a tropical cyclone to develop. We see that by the 7 day mark, while we do see a little bit of moisture right over Central America, we see that this area of moisture primarily moves straight to the west. And the problem with that is if the multitude of troughs that move towards the west move towards Central America, then it's less likely to have enough time over water to really intensify, for the pressure to really lower along the surface for the possibility of a tropical cyclone to be enhanced. And the European model is expecting a lot of these tropical disturbances primarily to move west towards Central America rather than take a slight turn further northward, which would allow the tropical waves to have more time over water to really intensify, which is the reason why that the European model isn't developing much of anything at all compared to the GFS model. So this is definitely raising the uncertainty with this forecast. It's gonna take likely several days before we're going to see at least one of the computer models cave in and be more in line with the other one. So the key will be, will the European model eventually lean more to the GFS's model scenario where it does bring a tropical storm to the Caribbean, or will we see the opposite happen where the GFS model follows what the European model has been suggesting over the next several days? Still too uncertain to stay right now, but it definitely will play a major role in terms of raising the certainty with this forecast. So we're likely going to need to wait several days before we can confidently say if this has a legit chance of developing of these tropical disturbances having a chance of developing into a tropical storm or not. I'll keep you guys updated. Like I said in my previous video, the key that will determine if we're going to have a high possibility of a tropical storm developing is how much ridging will be right over these tropical disturbances as they move westward. Because if the ridging is a little bit weaker and we see this trough that's located along the eastern half of the United States dip down a little more, that would weaken the ridging and that would enhance the southerly flow along the surface to force a lot of these tropical disturbances to move a little bit further northward. And the time it moves further northward would mean that it would have more time over water to have a good possibility of developing into a tropical storm. However, if the ridging is a little bit too strong, that would force tropical waves further westward, and that would mean that it wouldn't move north enough to develop right over the warm Caribbean waters, and would primarily be inhibited by land interaction as it moves westward, because we do see that there isn't a lot of time for a tropical disturbance to develop if it were to move straight westward, because it only has this small area of the Caribbean before it makes landfall somewhere along Central Americas. But we see that with the GFS model, the United States trough dips a lot more further southward towards the United States, which weakens the ridging right over the western Caribbean. So this would allow the tropical disturbance to move a lot further northward and have a good possibility of developing into a tropical storm, since it'll have more time over water. Comparing it to the European model, we see a clear difference at around the same time period on forecast hour 168 on Saturday, June 17th. We see that the ridging is a lot stronger, so we're going to see a lot more of a strong easterly flow that would force a lot of these tropical disturbances further westward to interact more with the land that's further westward, and that would mean it would have less time over water to have a possibility of shedding into a tropical storm, which is the reason why the European model is not developing any tropical storm, because the ridging is just too strong. And we see that this trough that's located right over the eastern half of the United States isn't digging down far enough to shift the wind direction from an easterly direction to more of a southerly direction that would force the tropical disturbance further northward. So this is the reason why the European model isn't expecting a tropical disturbance. We're definitely going to need to pay close attention to how the ridging builds over the next several days to determine if we will see Tropical Storm Bret in the Caribbean. The wind shear over this tropical disturbance will also play a major role, because of course if the upper level winds are too strong, then that diverts a lot of the energy away from the center of circulation, so we won't see the storm intensify as much as it could if it were under a lowly sheared environment. And taking a look at the wind shear forecast over the next 7 days, we do see that the wind shear is expected to be relatively light to moderate in the southern Caribbean, but very strong right over the Caribbean islands. However, the GFS model expects this storm to move over an area where the wind shear will be just light enough for this to organize itself and really to absorb a lot of the energy surrounding it without the upper level winds diverting it away from the center of circulation. And we see that right here. The wind shear is just light enough for this to continue to intensify, and it could encounter more wind shear as it moves further northward. But we do see that the upper level winds move at towards the same direction as this storm would move if it were to move this far up northward. So the wind shear wouldn't be as strong despite the upper level winds being very strong over this storm by the time it approaches Cuba. And the strong upper level winds in fact might enhance the storm's intensity because it would increase the outflow. That would definitely decrease the amount of air molecules that's located right over the center of circulation, and that would promote more lift for this storm to rapidly intensify, even though it would be under a strongly sheared environment. So the wind shear will definitely play a big role over the next several days. It seems like the European model is showing a very similar forecast to what the GFS model is stating when it comes to wind shear. The European model expects a little bit more of a strongly sheared environment to exist over the Caribbean. However, the European model also agrees that there's going to be an area of wind shear that's towards southern Caribbean and western Caribbean that's going to be just light enough to potentially support for a developing tropical storm if the European model were to go that route. So the wind shear right now is looking favorable for this storm if this were to move further northward. But again, we're still very far out. This could change, so we're going to definitely keep an eye on this as well. In terms of the 7-day graphical tropical weather outlook provided from the National Hurricane Center, we see that no new tropical cyclones are currently expected over the next 7 days. However, I wouldn't be surprised that within the near future, potentially as early as tomorrow, we could see that change where the National Hurricane Center does detect that does indicate that there could be that possibility of tropical cyclone development right over the Western Caribbean, since we've seen this very, very persistent scenario from the GFS model that wants to develop a highly convective environment right over the Southern Caribbean. So I do believe that the National Hurricane Center will eventually change this current forecast when it comes to the tropical weather outlook. So definitely keep an eye on this over the next several days, because I wouldn't be surprised that as early as tomorrow we could see the National Hurricane Center shift its forecast. We see that the GFS Ensemble members still do agree that some sort of low pressure system will develop just off the Central American coast, and we do see that some Ensemble members want to develop this into nearly tropical storm status. So there's definitely that possibility that the GFS model has been leaning towards over the past several days. So there's definitely at least something to be aware of. So here's a global tropics hazards outlook over the next few weeks. We do see that as we approach the week of June 14th, the Gulf of Mexico is expected to experience conditions that are drier than average, so as areas just south of the main development region. However, right over the Caribbean, we should primarily expect average precipitation over that area. So there's still that possibility of tropical cyclone development even if the Gulf of Mexico does experience less precipitation than average. However, as we approach the week of June 21st, the forecast is definitely set to change as we right over the Western Caribbean, where a higher amount of precipitation is expected, and same goes for the main development region. So there is that enhanced possibility of tropical storm formation thanks to an increased area of convection that's expected for the week of June 21st. Also, again, taking a look at the MJO forecast over the next several weeks, we do see that the most likely scenario for much of South America is that you're going to be under a negative MJO pattern, which would promote more convection and potentially more tropical cyclones than average, while the Caribbean and the main development region will likely miss out on this small area where the MJO pattern is negative. It should at least be close enough to potentially feel the effects of the higher amount of convection that's occurring over South America, since we could easily see this convection move further northward, especially since, like I said, we do see a weakness in ridging that allows this convection to move further northward, which would enhance tropical cyclone development over the Caribbean. So I do expect that the negative MJO pattern that's relatively close to the northern Atlantic will promote an enhanced risk of tropical storm development. So in terms of my overall forecast regarding the possibility of Tropical Storm Bret, so I do believe that each day that passes where the GFS model is persisting on a tropical storm developing, the more likely it becomes, because the more that the GFS model persists, the less likely that the GFS model is just showing a fantasy storm, and more likely the GFS model has at least some knowledge, or at least is getting some indication that there could be a tropical storm that develops by next weekend. So we're definitely going to pay close attention to this. The European model still is not confident that there's going to be a weak enough area where of ridging where this storm will able to move further northward, but the GFS model does expect that. So we're really going to need to pay close attention to how the two ridges build right over the Gulf of Mexico to really determine the possibility of Tropical Storm Bret. But yeah guys, that's it for now, and thank you guys for watching.